Have you ever wanted to own your own country? Well, it turns out you can. Today, we're going to be talking about the bizarre history of micronations. A micronation is typically a self-proclaimed country, often without recognition from any official governments or international institutions. Despite being a silly concept, the actual history of these mini countries is some of the most insane and fascinating things I have ever learned about. So let's get started with arguably the most famous micronation, the Principality of Sealand. To understand how the Principality of Sealand came about, we're first going to have to talk about British radio licensing. You see, in the 1960s, the British upper classes disapproved of all of this degenerate rock and roll music, which meant that the major broadcasting companies like the BBC would typically only play it for a few hours a day. To get around this, people would typically listen to unlicensed independent radio stations. This was called pirate radio. In order to avoid police, these stations typically operated offshore on boats or abandoned forts. One of these forts was called the Fort Ruffs and was operated by a man named Roy Bates. Now, if I know anything about the English government, it's that they hate two things. The first being someone that is slightly a different color to them, and the other being fun. Because of this, they decided to crack down on these independent stations, issuing out large fines to anyone found broadcasting without a license. This forced most pirate radio stations to shut down. However, Roy Bates had an idea. Although he was operating in an old English fort, the British government only had claim to around 3 nautical miles from their coastline. However, Fort Ruffs was 7 nautical miles. This meant that Roy Bates and his radio station was placed firmly within international waters. In order to no longer be governed by any English laws, Roy Bates came up with the genius idea to declare his fort as independent from the English government. Thus, the Principality of Sealand was born. Roy then declared himself as prince and his wife princess. Why he didn't decide to declare himself as king, I have no idea. Everything was going smoothly until a year later in 1968, in which Roy was summoned to court. However, he wasn't summoned to court for starting his own nation. You see, several workmen had approached his territorial waters in order to do maintenance on a nearby buoy. It is then when Roy's teenage son fired several warning shots at the men on behalf of his father. As I mentioned earlier, Roy was summoned to court for this, but it was then ruled by the court that due to all of this happening in international waters, the English government didn't actually have any jurisdiction to charge Roy with any crime. Roy then took this as an acknowledgement that Sealand had been recognized by the government as its own sovereign state. It was also around this time when reportedly Roy and his family were forced to defend Sealand against other invading pirate radio stations. Because there were only so many forts, it meant that they became incredibly valuable. This meant that other radio stations literally became pirates, as they intended to use force to try and capture these forts for themselves. Roy claims that he would often have to shoot at and throw Molotov cocktails at these invading pirates. However, this is far from the craziest thing that happened at Sealand. Roy had appointed a man named Alexander Uchenbuck as the Prime Minister of Sealand. However, he had a differing perspective regarding the future of the country. You see, a fort in international waters is incredibly valuable, especially one that has already been proven to be out of the reach of the English government. Alexander wanted to turn Sealand into an off-the-books casino for the rich and powerful that didn't have to pay any taxes or follow any restrictions from any other country. However, Roy disagreed. Alexander then invited Roy and his wife to his home in Salzburg, Austria, to discuss a potential sale of the country, leaving just their son Michael to man the fort. However, while Roy and his wife were kept busy in Austria, Alexander had hired several German and Dutch mercenaries to forcefully take Sealand. They conducted a multi-pronged attack, with some descending from helicopters while some attacked from jet skis from below. They then took Michael hostage, locking him in a cell for several days before eventually dropping him off in the Netherlands. Despite not having a passport, Michael was able to successfully smuggle himself back into England, in which he was reunited with his family. However, his parents were not super happy to see him. Despite seeing their son again after being captured by mercenaries, Roy and his wife were actually very disappointed in Michael, as he was unable to defend their home against the attacking foreign forces. Despite this, they all immediately started making a plan on how they were going to retake Sealand. Along with several friends and allies of the fallen royal family, Roy was able to successfully retake Sealand, capturing both the mercenaries and Alexander Uchenbach. Roy refused to release his former Prime Minister unless he paid a fee of £35,000. Due to Roy holding these men in international waters, the German government sent out several diplomats to try and negotiate with Roy and his family. Eventually, Roy relented and ended up releasing the members of the failed coup. Because the German government sent out diplomats to negotiate with Roy, he ended up taking this as them acknowledging the sovereignty of his country. Another funny detail about the coup is that after Alexander Uchenbach and his allies were released, they declared themselves as in exile and called themselves the Sealand rebel government. However, the history of Sealand does not end here. Over the years, the country of Sealand has been involved in many schemes, such as when a bunch of scammers created several fake websites using the name of Sealand to sell fake legal documents, such as passports, birth certificates, and university degrees. People were using these fake documents to do all sorts of things, such as apply for jobs and open bank accounts. It is believed that over 160,000 people purchased fake Sealand documents from these websites. Additionally, the scammers were involved in several more serious crimes such as drugs and weapons trafficking. Eventually, the Spanish government caught on and decided to arrest these people. However, they claimed that they couldn't be arrested as they were in the Sealand embassy in Madrid. However, due to the fact that they were just, making all of this up, the Spanish government didn't care and arrested them anyways. But respect for trying. Honestly, the commitment to the bit is very impressive. Like, not only did these people claim that they had diplomatic immunity, they claimed that they had diplomatic immunity from a country that does not exist. Like, why on earth would you think that would work? During the investigation, it was revealed that this scammer group actually had ties, strangely enough, to the Sealand rebel government and the disgraced former Prime Minister Alexander Uchenbach. Even though Sealand wasn't affiliated at all with these scammer groups, they weren't opposed to using their country for other legally dubious endeavors. Sealand hosted servers for many online gambling and porn sites because due to them being in international waters, they weren't subject to any laws. However, it is important to note that they did have a moral code and they weren't hosting any content that was, like really bad. Interestingly enough, the website Pirate Bay actually tried to buy Sealand. For those of you who don't know, Pirate Bay was this massive online piracy juggernaut, and they were trying to buy Sealand as a place to host all their servers. However, the asking price for the fort was around £600 million. So needless to say, Pirate Bay did not end up buying the country. Sealand is still in operation today despite Roy's death in 2012. Due to the incident with the scammers, you can't buy anything like a passport from them. However, you can become an e-citizen, and they do sell things like night ships, and for a small fee, you can even become something like a baron or a duke. Today, Fort Ruffs is basically abandoned. There is only one person living there, and their job is just to kind of maintain the fort and protect against anyone who tries to claim it for themselves. I absolutely love the story of Sealand because there is no reason as to why it should have such a dramatic history. Like, there was a literal coup done by a terrorist cell that then went into exile only to pop up years later with ties to a fraud and like weapons trafficking ring. Like, why does it have such a colorful history? Like, I don't know. I just love this. By the way, if you're enjoying this video so far, please consider leaving a like or subscribing. I'm kind of new to this whole YouTube game, so it really is encouraging. I always do kind of feel awkward about this part, but if you're enjoying this video, please consider just leaving a sub, and if you're not, I'm sorry to disappoint. Anyway, on to our next entry, the Principality of Hutt River. The next micronation on this list holds a special place in my heart, and that's because it comes from my home, the land down under, Australia. Just like the Principality of Sealand and British radio licensing, in order to understand the Principality of Hutt River, we're going to have to talk about the Australian wheat industry. In 1968 and 1969, Australia grew a massive surplus of wheat. This was a problem because the only buyer of Australian wheat was the Australian Wheat Board, and they had previously agreed to buy anything an Australian farmer grew. This led to them being forced to buy huge amounts of wheat that was just essentially left to rot bought in silos. In order to combat this problem, they introduced a wheat quota, in which they would calculate based off the size of your farm how much wheat they were willing to buy from you. This was a huge problem as a large number of Australian farmers were now not making enough to maintain their farms. One such farmer was a man named Leonard Casely. Leonard had already done all his planting for the year, and now with the newly implemented wheat quota, he was only going to be able to sell around 1% of his crop. Leonard, along with some other farmers, tried to plead with the government to change this. However, this was unfruitful. They then tried to sue the Australian Wheat Board, but this was also unsuccessful. And so with his back against the wall, Leonard did the only thing he could think of. At the beginning of 1970, Leonard seceded from Australia, declaring himself independent. Thus, the Principality of Hutt River was born. Leonard declared himself as the prince of his nation and not the king, and this is because despite his beef with the Australian government, he was a true and loyal supporter of the Queen and the English monarchy. This is a bit of a side note, but Leonard would actually frequently write to the Queen, and one letter in which he was wishing her a happy birthday, he actually got a response, wishing him and Hutt River a happy 46-year anniversary. Now, whoever wrote this letter must have not checked as to what Hutt River was, but it is very funny to think that the English monarchy has acknowledged this little farm in Australia as its own independent country. The strangest thing about this whole situation is that Leonard's plan actually worked. One of the reasons why I love Australia is that we are such a deeply unserious country. Like, when the government saw that Leonard just declared himself as independent, they were just kind of like, yeah, right. And he was able to sell all of his wheat to the Australian Wheat Board without issue. Another thing I can't believe is that Leonard was able to get away with not paying taxes for the next 45 years. In 1977, 7 years after the founding of Hutt River, Leonard was contacted by the Australian Taxation Office, which is our version of the IRS, in which they informed him that he was being prosecuted for failing to send them several important documents. However, nothing really came from this, and despite being found guilty, Leonard was able to kind of just continue on as normal. And then shortly after, he declared war on Australia. It's so funny looking at Leonard's relationship with the Australian government, because everything he does is done out of this just bitter defiance. And they're just so patient with him. For instance, at one point, Leonard started making his own currency, and this was kind of creating a bit of an issue. And in order to kind of just find a middle ground, the courts ruled that Leonard would be able to continue to make his currency as long as he just keeps it within the confines of his own little country. However, a good thing can't last forever. And in 2017, the Australian government told Leonard, look, dude, we've had our fun, but you've seriously got to start paying your taxes. And this was absolutely devastating for Hutt River, as Leonard had not paid his taxes in the last 47 years. And because of this, Leonard was required to pay the Australian government $2.7 million, or they were going to start seizing his assets. Although he tried to get this dismissed, he was ultimately unsuccessful. However, if I know one thing about Leonard Casely, is that he does not back down from a fight, and he still had one final trick up his sleeve. Leonard George Casely died in 2019. They say in this life, two things are guaranteed, and that is death and taxes. However, what they don't tell you, and what the government doesn't want you to know, is that you can actually use one to escape the other. The debt then passed down to his son Graham, who at the time was the ruling monarch of Hutt River. This, in combination with the COVID-19 pandemic, completely shut down the country's tourism industry. This meant that after 50 years of independence, Hutt River was forced to relinquish its sovereignty and rejoin Australia. The royal family was forced to sell the property in order to pay off the taxes. However, listening to interviews of them talk about it, they really don't seem that upset by it. The family viewed Hutt River as their father's legacy, and it seems as though they didn't really want to maintain it without him. I'm going to paraphrase a quote that comes from his daughter, which really kind of encapsulates their whole attitude towards it. It's like when a band loses its lead singer, it never really is the same. I like the story of Hutt River because it really kind of captures the essence of what I think it means to be Australian. Leonard Casely was proud to dedicate nearly 5 decades of his life to simply pissing off the Australian government because one time they didn't buy his wheat. It's also funny because at the time of his death, wheat quotas hadn't been a thing for nearly 30 years. It is time to move on to our third and final micronation, and out of the ones we've covered is the only one that you can still visit today, and that is the Republic of Molossia. The Republic of Molossia was founded in 1977 by its self-proclaimed dictator, Kevin Bore. Unlike the previous 2 entries on this list, the Republic of Molossia wasn't formed in any sort of political protest or as a way to get around any sort of restrictive legislation. The best way to describe it is probably as a performance art piece. I believe that Kevin Bore simply started his micronation because he thought it would be funny. Located in the Nevada desert, it's really hard to tell how serious the Republic of Molossia is. Although they have things like their own currency and border control, they also have stuff like the Molossia Navy, which consists of 2 kayaks. They also claim that they are currently at war with East Germany, despite it dissolving in the 1990s. Even though Molossia is predominantly a tourist attraction, there is this earnestness to it that is quite hard to explain. After watching interviews with their glorious leader, Kevin Bore, I do get the sense that he really does care about his fake little country, despite him embracing the silliness of the whole thing. However, I have this theory that it's not as shallow as it might seem. I partly believe that he does this simply so that the US government doesn't bother him. You see, the Principality of Sealand is located in international waters, and the Principality of Hutt River was in Australia, which kind of culturally accepts all its oddballs and nut jobs. However, the Republic of Molossia is in the US, and from where I'm sitting, the US government doesn't seem to be as accepting of people doing acts of blatant defiance against it. My theory is that one of the reasons why Molossia is so silly is so that they don't get Waco'd. Take for instance their currency. Although Molossia has an official currency, if it was based in something like the gold standard, this might create some problems. And so instead, to get around this, they base it in the far more useful cookie dough. Although this is a joke, it is also a clever way at making sure the US government doesn't mess with your fictional currency. Although Molossia is kind of a joke, I think it is important to bring up as it kind of shows the state of where micronations are at today. Although the concept of a micronation is very silly, there were at least times in recent history in which some people took it very seriously to the point in which they were willing to risk their lives for their made-up country. Micronations are this weird little blip in recent history, and despite some of their questionable ethics, I just can't help myself from rooting for them. It's just some larger than life people that when faced with insurmountable odds, instead of caving where most of us would, they decide to carve a path for themselves that few before them have dared to tread. Anyway, that brings us to the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing. As I mentioned earlier, it really does mean a lot. I really enjoyed learning and telling you about this, and if you want to see more videos like this, please leave a comment. Anyway, till next time,